Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. We're honored today to have a very special guest, Ambassador Robert Zoellick, who not only had an extraordinary career at State Department, Treasury, the White House, president of the World Bank, but he was also a recipient of FPRI's Benjamin Franklin Award, which honors extraordinary service as a scholar, statesman, and/or soldier. He's also written an extraordinary book that explores and illuminates the history and traditions of U.S. foreign policy. America in the World, a history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. And in our chat window today, we're going to also be featuring a very positive review of his new book written by Dov Zakheim, one of our trustees. And that review will be appearing in the winter edition of Orbis, our scholarly journal. Today's event is part of our new series, People, Politics, and Prose, which is hosted and moderated by Ron Granieri. Most of you know Ron, but for those of you who don't, Ron is the executive director of our Center for the Study of America and the West, and he's a Templeton Fellow at FPRI. He's also currently a history professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, and thus I will have to include our obligatory disclaimer that any views you hear today are the views of our speakers and not necessarily those of FPRI, the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the Army War College. I'd also like to introduce someone whom many of you know, Ambassador Adrian Bezora, who will also be participating in the Q&A portion of our program. Adrian is a trustee of FPRI, a chair of our Eurasia program, and past president of the Eisenhower Fellows, and a U.S. diplomat with a long and stellar career at the U.S. State Department, where he served as U.S. ambassador in Prague during a historic period where he worked closely with Czech and Slovak leaders to assure a successful transition before and following Czechoslovakia's Velvet Divorce. Before I turn this over to Ron, I'd like to once again thank our supporters and our members. Without you, we could not bring you programs like this. A few housekeeping notes. We encourage you to submit your questions and do that in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen because it says Q&A. Not the chat box. That's where you can put a note to us if you have any technical problems. And as I mentioned, we'll also be putting in the chat box a link to Dov Zakheim's wonderful review of Ambassador Zoellick's new book. So I'd also very quickly like to give a plug for an event we're having tonight, which you can read about on our website. It's a town hall on U.S.-China relationships. It's on U.S.-Chinese relations, hosted by our director of our Asia program, Jacques Delisle, and it's a collaboration between FPRI and University of Pennsylvania. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's new program of conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri, and on behalf of all of FPRI, I thank you for joining us this afternoon on Zoom. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Ever since John Winthrop urged his followers to see their Puritan settlement as a city upon a hill, American leaders have struggled with the temptation to view their experiment in self-government as a special actor in the world, and even more, with the practical implications of how to play that role. Inspiring intense debates spiced with powerful rhetoric. George Washington admonished against international entanglements to preserve American Republican virtue, seconded by John Quincy Adams, who declared that the United States should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Meanwhile, ambitious leaders from Benjamin Franklin to Alexander Hamilton to Theodore Roosevelt pursued an empire of liberty, while Woodrow Wilson imbued American foreign policy with a crusading spirit to make the world safe for democracy that has inspired presidents of both major parties over the past century, with results both inspiring and horrifying. It may be a particularly American flaw to believe that the U.S. has a special gift of democracy and the responsibility to share that gift with others. It is certainly true that American leaders and the public have not yet reached a consensus on how best to share that gift. As we enter a new period of transition, it is well that we take stock of where we have been and where we are most likely to go. Our guest today, Robert B. Zoellick, calls his new book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, a, quote, book of stories about the history of American diplomacy, and presents a narrative focusing on the individual leaders, mostly, but not exclusively, presidents, with some secretaries of state and diplomats, and even a presidential science advisor, to show how foreign policy has been made. Reflecting his position as both a historian and a practitioner, Zoellick encourages his readers to look beyond philosophical pronouncements to track the pragmatic tradition in American diplomacy. So what is that tradition? What lessons can we learn from the past to help guide us into the future? These questions and yours will guide us in discussion with Robert Zoellick. Robert Zoellick has served as Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary, and Counselor of the State Department, Ambassador and U.S. Trade Representative, Counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury, Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, and President of the World Bank. His experience spans 6 U.S. presidencies during the Cold War, in its closing chapter, and into the first decades of the 21st century. Ambassador Zoellick is now a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he contributes to the Applied History Project. And we are delighted to have him with us today to talk about his book. Welcome, Ambassador Bob Zoellick.
Thank you, Ron. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and Raleigh and Adrian. So thanks for having me.
You bet. So I want to start with a basic question. Is what led you to decide to spend your time after your government service writing this book?
Well, when I was in government, I often drew on history as I thought about problems. And so I wanted to encourage others to think about foreign policy in those terms, particularly a younger generation. Many of the people with this program are probably aware Henry Kissinger wrote a book in the 90s titled Diplomacy, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. But I always had a sense it was written from a European perspective. So I wanted to try to do something that would talk more about the American experience and ideas. And as you mentioned, Ron, the approach I took was to use stories about people in particular episodes. So I wanted to reach a wider audience. In some ways, the book is a multiple biography, but I also wanted to focus on the practical problem-solving nature. And here, what I'm distinguishing is that my sense in many universities now, courses on foreign policy are taught using international relations theory. And that's fun to play with. However, as Adrian probably knows, I'm not sure it's actually very relevant for when you're sitting down and trying to deal with sort of particular issues. So when I was dealing with issues like German unification or Darfur or climate change or the World Bank or trading issues, I think there was a different approach to try to solve the problem. So in effect, what the book is a series of case studies, and I try to give enough background so people can understand what was going on. I add my assessments as a practitioner, but in a way I'm inviting people to think about what they would do in these situations. And I suppose if you're going to write a book, you have to really love the subject matter. And I've always loved diplomatic history since I took it in college at nearby Swarthmore here for FPRI. But my sense is, as a discipline, it is somewhat faded in the university community, partly because of the understandable interest in bringing in underappreciated actors and events. But I think we've lost something. In some ways, there's been a fragmentation of the field. And I noticed that Fred Logoval, a good diplomatic historian up at Harvard, wrote a piece in the New York Times not long ago where he said, why have we stopped teaching political history? And then I suppose the last thought is, in my various executive posts, I imagine I used to torture some of my younger assistants by asking them questions about history. I just had no idea what they had learned. And I discovered insofar as they had learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. Mm-hmm. And actually the first 150 years of the American experience are wonderful and quite fascinating. So I wanted to retrieve some of these lost figures from history.
Well, I can't, as a fellow historian, I can't disagree with any of those motivations. So I think that's a great way to get started. You, the idea of building the narrative on stories, right? Obviously, any historian knows that it's all about the choices that you make. And some of the people that you choose to write about are, will be familiar to a casual reader of U.S. history and the history of U.S. foreign policy. But there are a couple who I think are, can genuinely be considered underappreciated. And one of them I wanted to ask, to give you an example of sort of why you choose and what you build around the individual, is the role of Warren Harding's Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes. I think what the phrase that I just said is something that most of the people listening to this have probably never heard all in one sentence, right? Let's talk about Warren Harding's Secretary of State, who is actually one of the most accomplished American political leaders of the early 20th century, and that being Charles Evans Hughes. Tell us about why you chose to talk about Hughes, and what is it about Hughes in the story that works for you in your narrative?
Yeah, I really enjoyed researching Hughes. So for your audience who may not be aware, he was a governor of New York. He was a justice on the Supreme Court. He ran against Woodrow Wilson for the presidency in 1916. Only lost by about 3,800 votes from the state of California, so it's relevant to today's world of recounts. And then he becomes Secretary of State, and later he goes on to become very successful and important Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is a very accomplished man. And he, like another figure that I talk about in this area, Elliot Root, I think are important because these are people who were not utopians by any means. One's associated with arms control, another with international law. But it's always important to look at people in their context. And their context was they were trying to deal with a United States that had become a power, but was in some ways a reluctant power. Woodrow Wilson had failed with the League of Nations and Versailles Treaty. As you mentioned, going back to Washington and Jefferson, Americans were reluctant about alliances. Had even joined World War I, not as an alliance partner, but as an associated set of power. They wanted to avoid the European balance of power arrangement. So how did they engage internationally? And in particular, Hughes comes in a context where the United States Senate, basically, there's a member of his own party. In fact, it's a name from the Pennsylvania area, Boyce Penrose, says it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State, the U.S. Senate's going to run foreign policy anyway. But Hughes was very shrewd in understanding both the policy and the politics. And he recognized that there was a deep disappointment in the United States and much of the world after what was seen as the lack of real accomplishment after World War I. There was a movement to control naval arms. There was budget cuts. There was unfinished business in the Pacific. Japan had continued to occupy the Shantung Peninsula in China. That was one of the things that led to the May 4th movement in China. They were also in Siberia. Japan had a military alliance with Great Britain that troubled the United States, who had Pacific islands the question was, they had been German islands, and what was the question of who would have them under League of Nations set of mandates. And so quite effectively, Charles Evans Hughes pulls these together and creates his own momentum for a combination of arms control and regional security. And I emphasize the two together because, at least when I studied this many years ago, many people focus simply on the naval arms control part. And I think that misses what Hughes was about. And in particular, he understood that arms control was a process. It wasn't a result. It had to be related to the security context. There was the convergence in the early 1920s of some national security interests, but it turned out to be temporary. It's a recognition relevant for today that you need to sort of reassess and also reinforce and at times redirect when you have some of these arrangements. And of course, it's also interesting to, as I talk about in the chapter a little bit, to understand sort of the unintended consequences of arms control. So they were controlling battleships, which were the powerful missiles of the day and weapons. And so a lot of the development goes into aircraft carriers and submarines. Michael Green discovered in his book that Admiral Nimitz did his Naval War College thesis on how to project power in the Western Pacific when you don't have bases. Interesting set of developments. The Marine Corps, of course, develops more of its expeditionary capabilities. So this is, I think, sort of interesting to reflect how these fit together. And to think about this today, when I looked at the Iran nuclear deal, or frankly, the discussions with North Korea, I think it's a mistake to look at them solely in terms of nuclear arms control. You have to see them in terms of the regional security arrangement. And coincidentally, my book a couple times looks at Northeast Asia, because this is also where Teddy Roosevelt mediates the Russo-Japanese War. And if you're really going to ever deal with a security issue in Northeast Asia, you're going to have to figure out how you involve, at this point, both Koreas, Japan, China, and Russia. And it's not simply a technical question of arms control. Now, of course, in terms of the results with Charles Evans Hughes, basically it leads to a security balance at a lower level. There is an opportunity with Japan, and it's quite intriguing. In the 20s, there was a debate in Japan about playing a role as an economic power, which it does after World War II. But that's somewhat dashed by the Great Depression and fundamentally by a contest as Chiang Kai-shek gets more authority in China with Japan over Manchuria. We successfully end the Great Britain-Japanese sort of alliance, which in some ways becomes the start of the special partnership for much of the 20th century. That, of course, leads to better relations with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. There's some dampening of great power competition without a commitment to enforce security. And this is a key point with a couple of the chapters. I was struck when former Secretary of Defense Mattis stepped down. He made an observation where he said, you know, the United States no longer has total domain dominance. And this was a shock to him in terms of his, the need for his security diplomacy. Well, of course, in much of US history, we didn't have total domain dominance. Right. So the question is, you know, how do you handle diplomacy when you have sort of a weak or a moderate hand? And of course, there was one other piece in this one where I think I traced it to Ernest May, a great diplomatic historian. And I hadn't focused on this, but during this time in the 20s, you actually had a number of these regional security arrangements. You had Locarno dealing with the former Ottoman Empire and Lausanne in Eastern Europe. You had the Polish sort of Soviet sort of accommodation. You had sort of the Washington Treaty Arrangement. And they were all fundamentally interlinked with the involvement of the US and a healthy world economy. And when that sort of comes apart, the system comes apart. And I think that's also interesting to reflect on for today, Ron, because you know, in some ways you're seeing greater regionalization of policies. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I do think, again, the US role in all those regions will be important, but that's one of the questions that we're debating today.
Sure. And the idea, I want to ask this broad question, and then we're going to come back, but especially when you talk about Hughes and you talk about Root, there is a vision of American policy. I know George Kennan said that one of the trends in American policy was moralism and legalism, that they tended to go together, that the Americans have a tendency to want to believe that if we can just get the right agreements, everybody can agree. And Kennan didn't like that idea very much, right? He didn't describe it because it was a positive thing. But when you describe it in terms of what Hughes and Root were up to, it basically sounds better. And I'm curious whether you feel that there is a need to encourage Americans to rethink the importance of multilateral agreements and the importance of American participation in these kinds of agreements. Is this something that we should take away from our study of the American policy in the beginning of the 20th century?
Well, as you know, there's different schools about kind of that idea. Let me start with Kennan. Yes, Kennan had quite a negative view of lawyers, in part because he comes up with this, I think, somewhat sort of straw man about sort of international law principles. I mean, if you think, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, who was no fool when it came down to power, considered Elihu Root sort of his strongest partner. Root was a leader of the international law movement. Keep in mind, Kennan didn't get along with Atchison either. He didn't consider Atchison to be a serious man of foreign policy, because it turns out that Kennan tends to believe the only people who are serious on foreign policy are George Kennan. So
his inability to agree with most everybody kept him out of government for most of his career, correct?
Well, and I mean, he's a great thinker. Actually, I have a chapter in the 1947-49 period where I also try to revive a man named Will Clayton, who was quite important on the economic side. He doesn't write as lyrically and historically as Kennan does. So he's not, and he didn't write his own autobiography. So he's sort of not sort of remembered in the same way. But I think coming back to the key point is that what I try to talk about in the book is the multiplicity of devices that the United States uses, whether they're treaty arrangements, international regimes, institutions. I mean, you know, keep in mind, I think the first example of an international arbitration and agreement was the Jay Treaty of 1795. The Rush-Bagehot sort of accord demilitarizes the Great Lakes with the United States and Britain, and in fact Canada, which is quite an important security arrangement for the United States going forward. So I happen to believe, as I suspect you do, Ron, that the nation state is still sort of the key agent of power. But if you're thinking today about issues of biological security, for example, you know, we've lost more people to this pandemic than we did in World War I, Korea, and Vietnam. And obviously you're going to have to deal with that with a combination of states and international institutions, or if you're dealing with climate or sort of economic issues. So I think one of the things I try to do in the book is, while I talk about some of the traditional hard power issues and security topics, I do try to weave in the economic and transnational topics. You mentioned secretaries of state and diplomats and presidents. You left out my first chapters on a Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton.
Indeed.
And so in a way, I'm trying to sort of enrich the dimensions of the American portfolio of ideas for foreign policy.
Excellent. And well, and while we think about expanding that portfolio, I'd also like to expand our portfolio of participants in this conversation by inviting Ambassador Adrian Basora to join in. I know Adrian had a couple of questions that he wanted to pose in this conversation. Please, Adrian.
Well, thanks, Ron, for letting me in and on the discussion. And Bob, it's a terrific book, and I strongly applaud your emphasis on history and history told in common sense and practical terms as ways of assessing different approaches to foreign policy and lessons to be learned. I have a couple of questions for you to start off our discussion. The first goes back to the time when you were Counselor James Baker and I was working at the NSC. I remember well the role that you played in negotiating the German reunification, the reunification of Germany, which in turn was an essential part of President Bush 41's vision for a Europe whole and free and a broader transatlantic community. Your chapter on Bush as the alliance leader, brings the period back to life in fascinating and, in my view, very accurate detail. Now, 30 years later, however, this is the question: what prospects do you see for the U.S. to move back towards that general goal of Europe whole and free and a broader transatlantic relation? And would some of the lessons that you draw from the success of Secretary Baker and President Bush and yourself as a participant, some of the lessons from that period be applicable in a Biden administration?
So it's a particularly apt question this week, Adrian, because as you know, yesterday was the 31st anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is the week that sort of triggered that process. And I've talked and written about the German unification process elsewhere, but let me just highlight, in part, it was the United States fulfilling past commitments during 40 years of the Cold War. But also going a little bit to Ron's prior question, it was a recognition that while many historians in that era have focused on the Russia question, what happens with Russia, we were focused on the German question. The German question after 1871 is, what do you do with this big power in the heart of Europe without sort of natural borders? One answer after World War II was to split it into two different states, one of them democratic. But the democratic state was linked to the EC, then later the European Union, and of course NATO. And this is a good example. We were strong supporters of a united democratic Germany, but we wanted to do it within NATO and within the European structures. At the same time, and this goes to your point, Adrian, while we were fulfilling past commitments, we weren't blind to what was going to happen in the future. We knew that Germany would become the most important power within the new European system. And we hoped that how we handled German unification would give us an edge in dealing with Germany with all the unknown questions of the future. So when I look at the past 4 years in treatment of Germany, I sometimes scratch my head and sort of wonder what people are thinking about strategically. But there's another piece of that story, which you know well, which is to make this work, we had to adapt NATO. The Cold War was ending. It was a combination of NATO's policy, conventional forces arrangement. And I think this is an insight for today, because NATO always has to adapt. It's had to adapt in terms of its capabilities. Today, it has to deal with different types of threats from Russia, of hybrid forces. It certainly has to focus on cybersecurity issues. And more broadly, again, coming back to Ron's question, if we look at the broader transatlantic relationship, I think on issues of biological security, climate, technology, and cyber issues, and a point I share with Kissinger, I think the US-European relationship is going to be very important in terms of shaping China's future behavior. I think that having a good partnership with another set of free societies is going to be very, very important. And what I try to do in the book is, I emphasize after, as Ron talked about, the United States, in a sense, rejected alliances for our first 150 years. So in many ways, you can look at our diplomacy as an experiment in internationalism without alliances. After 1947-49, we create a new type of alliance system. And while we use the word alliances, it's very different than the European concept of alliances. Senator Vandenberg, who I also draw it in the book, is quite articulate on this. It's a political, diplomatic, economic type of partnership. And of course, it always has to change. And the question is, how will it change today? What is constant, and this would be a theme, I suspect, from an FPRI point of view, is there is still a geopolitical dimension of this with North America, which is, at the end of the day, we want to have good relations with the western and eastern borderlands of Eurasia. So it's a good example of how you can combine geopolitical logic with also transnational issues and sort of a changing political focus.
If I could come back here, Adrian, we'll come back to you in a second, but I noticed a couple of questions came in, and it relates to something you just talked about there, Ambassador Zoellick, and that is the idea of transnational cooperation becoming important. There's also the issue of, let's say, subnational cooperation, right? Lawrence Hughes points out that we have governors and mayors who complained about the rejection of the Paris Climate Accord, the possibilities of kind of subnational as well as transnational cooperations, especially in a federalist system that is the United States, right? How do we manage the sort of the interpenetration of our politics with international affairs, and what does this mean for the sort of Westphalian idea that sovereign nation states are the main building blocks of foreign policy?
Well, I think, both under the Constitution and as a matter of power and reality, the nation states are still going to be the major force. Mm-hmm. But the way that I start this in the book is how I talk about trade. I try to explain from the very start, trade was more than a matter of economic efficiency. I use the anecdote that we all know about Thomas Jefferson and his chairing the committee for the Declaration of Independence, or at least being the draftsperson. John Adams was on that committee, but John Adams chaired his own committee, which was to draft the Model Treaty of 1776. And that treaty is basically an economic arrangement. Now, what did it tell us in that time? What it told us was, this was a new state in a world of empires and mercantilism. And what the young United States was trying to do was pry it open for private sector actors. So where you talked about sub-state actors, I would expand it. It's a question of private companies. It's a question of cities. It's a question of civil society groups. The United States has traditionally, given our own nature, been an energetic proponent of those, but the question is, what frameworks do you have to create? And these will relate to issues, for example, I was sort of the lead for the one climate change treaty that's ever been ratified by the Senate in 1992. And that raised the question of how do you combine traditional diplomacy with scientific issues with degrees of uncertainty? That framework, by the way, is what is the basis for the Paris Accord and all the other committees of the parties that followed. And it tried to draw in an ongoing scientific review with sort of private parties. It tried to it had political commitments as opposed to formal legal commitments that would be sort of regularly reviewed as we learn more. And I think these are part of the challenges of a different type of diplomacy where you have different actors. And certainly in the climate change area, if the United States can basically draw together commitments from sort of the major 40 cities that Bloomberg put together, the C40, you'll have a significant effect on some of these sort of climate issues. So in a sense, what we're trying to draw out here is the richness of American diplomacy, not that it's an either or.
Good, great. Adrian, did you have a follow-up question?
Well, I'll leave the follow-up because the lessons to be drawn from the success of Baker and Bush, the Bush presidency, are implicit in Bob's answer to the question as to why it worked and how important it was, and how I assume he would recommend that Biden do the same, pursue the same goals and use similar techniques. But I have
just a word on that that's relevant, because I've written an op-ed that the Washington Post just told me they're going to print, and you'll find it interesting. I was drawing some comparison with the Bush 41 and to a degree the Reagan administration. And what I was trying to explain was, in those years, we didn't have control of the Congress. And some part of the Reagan administration, we had one house, the Senate. And the Bush 41 administration didn't have either house of Congress. And the question is, how does a president can a president work with a party of Congress controlled by the other side? And what I point out in this piece is I cite about 5 or 6 bipartisan examples of things in the cybersecurity area, scientific area, foreign assistance area, trade area, where you have practical examples of sort of Republicans and Democrats in Congress that have sort of tried to move forward issues. And I think Biden should be naturally inclined to do this, given his experience with the Senate. The question is, he's got to deal with expectations in his party, because his party kind of thought there was a new progressive era that was going to dawn, and it didn't. But so I honestly believe there's some possibilities here, but as you know, it requires a president willing to compromise, negotiate, sort of build friendships, and sort of make the constitutional system work.
Yes, and of course that's true in international diplomacy too. You've got to compromise.
Yeah.
Times, as you point out repeatedly in the book. My second question is on the on the China front, but it refers to your chapter, takes off from your chapter that you call American Realpolitik, about the Kissinger-Nixon, the Nixon administration and partnership with Kissinger and how they managed their breakthrough to China in 1972, despite the fact that Mao was deeply antagonistic and deeply ideologically opposed to the United States. Now, when you were U.S. trade representative, it was different times. You negotiated the entry of China into the WTO in 2001. But only 4 years later, you called on China to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Obviously, they weren't doing their part even then. And now, 15 years later, it looks like that's a very elusive goal, at least to me as a non-China hand. U.S.-China relations look much more confrontational, more like the 1960s than the early 2000s. So my question is, are there some lessons from what the enormous breakthrough that Kissinger and Nixon made in 1972? Do you see any potential analogies with Xi Jinping and the much more powerful China of today?
Well, unfortunately, as an honest analyst, I have to say I'm not sure that either country has acted like a responsible stakeholder the past 4 years. But it's always important to recognize the changes going on in other countries as well. And certainly we've seen a change under Xi. Kind of my favorite anecdote for this is that when he took over in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union. And he ordered all the party cadres to view the film. Now, if such a film were shown in Germany, Gorbachev would be the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, broke up his country, led to rack and ruin. And the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. And it's interesting, in the United States, we look upon the fall of the USSR as kind of a historical event. It casts a long shadow in Beijing, and one needs to sort of be aware of that. Now, I think the approach that Trump took was focusing first 3 years on the bilateral trade deficit, which economists will tell you is a sort of a foolish objective, and his trade deal didn't work out in reducing it in any way. But then with the coronavirus, he wanted to point the finger at China, and the relationship increasingly became zero-sum confrontation, or frankly, as even one former Chinese counterpart says, it's kind of a lose-lose model. And I think one of the things that's crept in, unfortunately, is there's a new conventional wisdom that cooperation with China failed. And frankly, this is just factually totally incorrect. I won't go through all the examples here. For those people interested in it, I wrote a piece in the National Interest in March and April where I just, everything from the economic to the proliferation to even some environmental topics. It's not to say that all is well with China. It's basically to say the work of diplomacy never ends in the process. And so I think, the logical point for the United States today, of course, we need to start at home in terms of our own society, our own economy, our science. Then we extend to allies, again, sort of a lesson sort of the Cold War period. In the security area, my own sense is that we're going to need to adjust some of the military capacities, focus more on an anti-access area denial strategy, just as the Chinese have. This probably means fewer big platforms that people can take out with missiles instead of greater autonomous submersible sort of network vehicles. There's actually some bipartisan interest in that, but the defense industry is a little cautious. And then there's various mutual interests, which I think one can still pursue. And, this is where, as you know, it requires kind of getting your hands dirty in diplomacy. So take intellectual property rights. It turns out that China has now created intellectual property rights courts where foreigners win about 85 to 90% of the time. But the penalties aren't high enough. So we should be negotiating higher penalties. This problem of forced technology transfer has been a real problem. It's prohibited by their accession to the WTO, but probably the best way to get at it is to push China to end a lot of the joint venture requirements, which sort of create the temptation. And while saying all this, I don't believe the United States should give up its values. So for example, on Hong Kong, as opposed to sanctioning leaders so we can't talk to them, I would take the British view and say, let's let some of the people from Hong Kong come to the United States. What better way to show the difference in societies? Now, you started out, Adrian, by talking about the Nixon-Kissinger view. And I think in the context that I would view that, remember, they're coming off this terrible debacle of Vietnam. They're, in a way, just as Charles Evans Hughes was trying to keep the United States engaged internationally, they're trying to use the drama of the opening to China to keep the American public involved. They were worried about sort of an isolationist tendency. And I think where they made their misjudgment, in part reflected that neither had much of a background in economics or technology. So they honestly believed that the United States was going to get weaker and they would use their machinations and triangular diplomacy to create a new balance of power. I mean, as it turned out in the Reagan era, we saw American economics and technology sort of surging ahead where the Soviet Union sort of fell behind. And that will lead to one of the questions for today as China moves to greater state control and greater Communist Party dominance, will the innovation that I think is going to be vital for the future sort of be part of the Chinese sort of technology ecosystem? It's an unanswered question. But I know, again, I think the United States would make a mistake if we follow China by trying to create walls and barriers, because traditionally our strength is being open into ideas and people and capital and trade and sort of making the United States a place where people from all over the world want to come.
And so thinking about that, about the larger principle that you described, right? That if the United States is better off being open to the world. There's a question from Steve Schinkel relates to this, is when you approach a complex question, do you use a framework or methodology or principles? And to combine that with a question that I've been thinking about is, what do we do? What does the diplomat, if you emphasize the pragmatic problem solving, what do historical examples, what do they do for you? Or what do you want them to do for you? Because you want to be flexible enough to solve a problem, but you also have to take things in that you know, to use a dirty word, that you have red lines that you don't want the other side to cross.
So I think when many people think about history and the guidance for policy, they jump to analogies. It's natural. That's, and we've done that today, but you have to be careful because analogies can often be misleading. I have found history most useful in prompting questions to ask. So if you think about it, think about any problem you would deal with, whether it's a foreign policy problem or kind of one in your neighborhood. To start out is sort of, what have people tried to do before? What worked? What didn't work, right? Then you might want to know, what are the institutions involved and what are their histories, to have a sense of what role they could play. What are the people involved? What are their backgrounds? What are the countries involved? As I was trying to think about Venezuela, I was, again, you could see the Trump administration was just trying to squeeze the Maduro. I was kind of wondering, well, what about the Brazilian military, and would they ever reach of this, or the Colombian, military and others, or how can you sort of affect Cuba? You need to know the background of the other players, and then all those sort of go to the question of kind of what combination of coalition. Timing is very important. I keep trying to draw that out in various chapters, knowing when to move. In the case of John F. Kennedy, there's some examples about being too eager in the sense of negotiation. These are sort of judgment questions at the end of the day. But I think those give you some sort of framework for trying to think about foreign policy problems. But then coming back to a point that you raised earlier, Ron, and I forgot to address, the other wrap on sort of case-by-case problem solving is that I think Kissinger used the phrase, it can be strategically nihilist. So you don't connect the dots. And I think so the lawyers who were most effective in this had a sense of case-by-case problem solving, but as I explained with Charles Evans Hughes, they saw how to try to connect the dots. It's important to have some sense of the frameworks and kind of, and some of those are geopolitical in nature, some of those are economic in nature, some of those are scientific in nature.
Right. To talk about geopolitics, right? It is interesting to know the history of a region, to understand that while specific regimes may change, there are certain things that are carried over, right? In a certain sense, the Venezuelan regime has still carrying over a rivalry with Colombia that goes back to the death of Simón Bolívar, right? So that that relationship is going to be complicated no matter what. There are a lot of different directions to go in here, but I did want to say that among the people out there listening to us, we talk about diplomatic history, is of course FPRI's own Walter McDougall, who wants to know that diplomatic history may be having problems, but he is well and is out there teaching as hard as ever. And in his work about American foreign policy, McDougall talks about the struggle, not just how difficult it is to come up with one guiding principle for U.S. foreign policy, but he basically sees two principles that are fighting with each other. The idea of the promised land that everybody should admire, and the crusader state that should force its admirability on everybody else. How do you, as somebody who has been involved in U.S. foreign policy, right? Have you seen these kinds of arguments or disagreements play out in actual policy discussions, right? Do you see this tension between promised land and crusader state in your experience?
Well, I have to start out by saying Walter is such a wonderful historian and such a wonderful resource for Indeed. Not only the FPRI, but the broader community. And his writing is so rich with color and sort of and illustrations. And like a good provocateur, he uses his frameworks. That book that you mentioned as kind of the four schools in the 19th century and the four schools in the 20th century. And I think that's useful in helping people understand the forces in play. It's a question in practical policy making of, if you're aware of those, kind of how do you try to sort of balance and integrate them? My answer on China to Adrian talked about kind of how I think it's important for the United States to continue to pursue the values issue. But is it just human rights sanctions, or is it a way of sending a bigger symbolism about the U.S. and the role in the world with Hong Kong? So that's a sort of an interesting sort of example. Another one would be going back to the question Adrian asked about sort of the world of 1989. Remember, the Henry Kissinger view in 1989 was that we needed to strike a condominium with the Soviet Union. And basically, for understandable reasons, he was worried about sort of a historical conflict. It got quickly dismissed as sort of a new Yalta, and so kind of fell to the side. But the Bush-Baker view was for a Europe whole and free. And that had a geopolitical dimension, it had an alliance dimension, but it also had a values dimension. And so I think, perhaps because of my experience on the economic side, I often find that sort of trying to use economics to open societies, build rule of law, build middle classes, those are important if you want to try to sort of build pluralistic and ultimately democratic societies. this is part of the challenge of kind of the neocon view for the Middle East, is I'm not sure that the ground sort of was prepared for the type of hope that they had. And it'll be a big debate about the future of China. And I think you see some of the efforts of Xi in some ways to turn the clock back. We'll see whether that's sort of successful over time. So I think it's inherent in the nature of the conduct of the diplomacy. And ultimately, I don't think the United States can sort of represent just a purely idealistic form, but I do think there's something, Root was quite a good example of this in some ways with his sort of view of how you treat other countries. And even to the point of sort of saying, you shouldn't treat small countries different than you would sort of like to be treated. Well, that might be a little bit idealistic. However, if part of your role over time is to build coalitions and support and bring people to your policy standard, if you would like, I mean, in the sense of a flag of your position, it's a way to sort of build trust and networks of support. And, part of, as Adrian knows, the work of diplomacy, Schultz used to call it the gardening, which is sort of, continuing to sort of treat people respectfully, listen to what they have to say, and sort of pull people together in coalitions. One of the frustrating things I think in the debate about foreign policy is when someone sort of talks about a certain objective and we say that, oh, well, Germany won't agree to that, or France won't agree to that, or Japan won't agree to that, there's kind of an idea, well, we should take all the marbles and go home. Kissinger used to refer to these as fantasy negotiations. That the diplomatic equivalent is, you state your point, and if the other guy doesn't agree, you speak louder and more slowly in the assumption they're going to agree. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. Diplomacy is not tourism to a strange place where they speak a different language, although the temptations are the same. One more direction, we've talked a lot about China, but I want to talk about economic policy more broadly, which does touch on China. Jerry Rubenstein asks about China's relationship to the dollar as a reserve currency, but Professor McDougall and also Razvan Ionescu both bring up, apparently there's news today that President-elect Biden has suggested that he is not disposed to revive the TPP. And I'm curious how you feel the United States should or shouldn't pursue multilateral solutions to trade, and whether it's worthwhile to think about reviving either the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, those two big ideas that the Obama administration delayed too long and the Trump administration allowed to die.
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me that Biden took that position. It disappoints me, and I think his international team know it's not in the strategic interest. But there are a couple of problems. One, the Democratic Party, particularly in Congress, still has a number of protectionist constituencies. Number two, the TPA, the negotiating authority, expires next year. And so given all the other demands that the president has, pandemic, economic recovery, sort of racial issues, climate issues, immigration issues, there's only so much that a person sort of can get done in the process.
True.
So I suspect that their trade policy will do first is stop doing stupid things like using tariffs against Canada and Mexico for national security reasons. They will try to sort of get the WTO appellate system back working again. But people often forget that process of blocking the judges for the appellate system actually began under the Obama administration. But I think there's a way that you could start to negotiate some of those items. The WTO clearly needs quick, sort of some short-term fixes, but also longer-term reforms, which we could talk about more kind of if you want. I have tried to suggest that the one idea that a Biden administration could pick up that sort of has a strategic dimension was the Democratic members of Congress did come around to support the USMCA rewrite of NAFTA. Frankly, it wasn't a huge rewrite. Some of the things they put in are actually not so good from a trading perspective, but if it built political support, why not take that and have the three North American economies negotiate with Great Britain? So as with the recognition that if labor union support is based on labor standards, kind of got to believe that Britain's labor standards should sort of meet their test. And that has the side benefit of that I'm quite concerned about the effect of the Lopez Obrador administration on Mexican institutions and sort of rule of law. So you want to sort of keep the Mexican system sort of close going forward. What all that brings to, Ron, is that in some ways, the appointment of the next US trade representative, which normally doesn't sort of hit the top tier, could end up being quite significant. Right. And let me explain why. And that is, if you look at the polls, Democratic voters are now more pro-trade than Republican voters. I think this is in part because it was associated with being against Trump. And also, I think it's younger voters who understand the international connections. But there are a number of Republican members of Congress, and I spoke to one actually just last Friday, that were frustrated with the Trump trade policy. And they're kind of looking for ways to kind of get it sort of back on track. So the challenge would be if Biden appoints somebody like Obama had in his first term, who was a mayor from Dallas, a very nice gentleman, but basically did nothing for 4 years, you're not going to make any progress. Michael Froman was more active in trying to move the TPP. His problem, as you sort of at least mentioned indirectly, was a sense of timing. Paul Ryan was very strong trade supporter, got TPA passed in 2015. If TPP had been ready in 2015, that would have given the administration 7 years. It would have gotten through the Congress and history would have been different, but it waited till the end. So the point being that if you have a entrepreneurial sort of USTR who tries to create a new trade coalition, some environmentalists, the healthcare, the data issues, sort of pulling together some of the younger voters, trying to pick up on some of these labor provisions. But it's a classic example of somebody having to be a bit of a policy innovator and entrepreneur. And we'll see.
We'll see, as in so many things. Unfortunately, we have a little less than 10 minutes to go and a bunch of questions, but one I want to get at that Fritz Heinzen asked, which I think will occupy a goodly amount of time. And that is when you look around the world, is there a region that you think the US is currently overlooking at its peril?
Well, at the heart of my book is I think we continually to overlook North America.
There you go.
And probably if you ask yourself, for the FPRI program, you probably have programs on Europe and Asia and maybe on the Middle East and maybe a little bit on Africa or Latin America, not North America. True. But what's interesting here, of course, is if you ask the American people, what are the topics they're interested in? You'll get things like immigration, you'll get organized crime and narcotics issues, you'll get economic recovery in sort of integration topics, environmental cross-border issues. And of course, if we talk about the challenge of nation building, I can understand the reluctance to necessarily try this in the heart of Central Asia, but your neighbor actually is pretty darn important. And there's a positive dimension too. And I discovered this quote from Ronald Reagan in 1979 as he launched his presidential campaign. It's almost unbelievable that a candidate launching a campaign would do this. He said, "It's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners." So he was trying to understand the notion of kind of a North American union, which Seward actually first invites, not a union by domination or giving up sovereignty, but in a sense, the magnet of the United States drawing these three together, respecting their independence and sovereignty. And that has a larger foreign policy dimension, because as we think about China or other players in the world, wouldn't we be better off if we've got 500 million people, 3 democracies, better demographics, energy self-sufficiency, ability to export? If we focus on the workforce, actually, you could have sort of better opportunities in terms of your human capital. That would make a continental base for the geopolitical discussion that you might want to have at FPRI.
I got to say, as the executive director of the Center for the Study of America and the West, challenge accepted. We'll have to bring you back to talk about this some more. But the idea of a revival of Pan-Americanism, but not a Pan-Americanism that is Uncle Sam bullying the neighbors, but rather something that pulls people together, which makes me think of one of the stories that you tell that is also underappreciated. And that is the work of Henry Clay as U.S. Secretary of State, who was indeed entranced by the idea of encouraging greater cooperation between the republics of the Western Hemisphere, right? Very few people remember Henry Clay was Secretary of State, which is a tragedy. He also should have been President of the United States at least once. That's another tragedy. But what should we think
he's
about?
Mitch McConnell's favorite former senator. So.
Oh, who's that? Oh, Mitch McConnell's favorite former senator. This is true. And my college roommate's high school was Henry Clay High School in Lexington. So what are you going to do? But what should we think about what can we go forward if we think about multilateral diplomacy, if we think about the United States taking North America seriously? Is there something we can try to build on this idea of Pan-Americanism, of Western hemispheric solidarity, mutual respect, that could get us beyond the very hostile notions that are, especially the hostile glances that are directed towards our neighbors to the south from the United States?
Well, I start with, I wanted to tell the story of Henry Clay, in part because it's a wonderful story of the cycle of American engagement and then withdrawal from Latin America. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you know, that story had a domestic political component. So since Clay became Secretary of State with John Quincy Adams after the alleged corrupt bargain, the Jacksonians were going to do everything they could to thwart. And just as a sort of a wonderful epitome of this, you know, they spend almost the first session of Congress trying to get the envoys appointed and get appropriations for the trip. They finally get it done. One of the guys dies along the way and the other arrives too late. So that's the story of America, sort of in Latin America. But there are other people. There's an effort in the late 19th century. Ella Herut actually made a very long trip to Latin America. It goes on. Obviously, FDR, and this was important as you're thinking about resources going into sort of World War II, Cordell Hull in the trade area. Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, of course, with the sort of the Summit of the Americas. I think what I would focus on first is the North American part, but that would include the Caribbean. Yeah, and that because that's also sort of part of security. Clearly, Central America is part of that because if you have broken states that are sort of almost taken over by criminal groups, that's going to create an immigration problem as well as a narcotics problem. There was a good story in the bipartisan effort in dealing with Colombia and saving Colombian democracy across the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. I guess what I've perceived is that in Latin America in general, it often has to start with the economic relationships. And we've gone through periods of sort of debt distress. We've gone through periods of trying to open trade markets. In a very practical way, Ron, just to give you a sense of how an administration can build on something. Recall the TPP grew out of prior free trade agreements we had done, so that of the 11 other countries, we already had free trade agreements with 6 of them, okay? You could have, and that created a framework for the other 5 to join. Well, if you look at our relationships in the Western Hemisphere, in addition to Canada and Mexico, we have free trade agreements with the 5 Central Americans, Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. So frankly, if you had a more pro-trade administration, the strategy would be to try to integrate those in a way sort of like a Western Hemispheric sort of TPP, and then find the moment when particularly Brazil, more likely than Argentina, is willing to sort of recognize that it needs to move away from protectionism. Mm-hmm. And you've had some of those moments actually kind of over the sort of the recent years. And then, part of diplomacy, of course, is setting things up. It's often not done within sort of one administration. So I think that and the ongoing effort to support the institutions of free societies is probably the soundest approach in Latin America. Mm-hmm.
I am sorry to say that we have already spoken for our entire hour. There are many more questions that are out there. There are many more questions people could ask. I encourage all of you to get yourselves a copy of Ambassador Zoellick's book, America in the World, which will address many of these questions. I also can say that for here at People, Politics, and Prose that we have on December 1st, we will be back to discuss the book by Seamus Hughes and Alexander Meliagru Hitchens on their book, Homegrown ISIS in America. But for today, I really want to thank you, Bob Zoellick, for joining us today to talk about your book. And I want to pass the baton back to President Raleigh Flynn to take us home.
You promoted me, Ron. First of all, thank you for an incredibly rich conversation. Ambassador Zoellick, Adrian, and Ron, really extraordinary and really exemplifies the best of what FPRI does. So thank you for this. If you enjoyed this and would like to relive it, we are recording it, and that video will be out to those who attended today sometime in the next 24 hours. It'll also be on FPRI's YouTube channel. So thank you again to our supporters and Ambassador Zoellick. It was a terrific discussion, and take care and stay safe.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.